Hello, and welcome to Foolish Musings. In this episode, we'll be examining the philosopher Plato. In this episode, we'll be examining who Plato was, his influences, his most important teacher Socrates, his theory of metaphysics, his theory of ethics and virtue, and how these all feed into his politics. As per usual, I'd like to start with some disclaimers. Plato has often been accused of being a handmaiden to tyranny, and is seen by some as a proto-communist or even a proto-fascist. And yet by others, he is seen as a guiding light throughout history. He is the founding father of virtue theory, and also one of the most prominent members of the Western intellectual tradition. Who was Plato? In this lecture, I hope to give a little bit of an understanding both of who Plato was as an individual, noting that he was born, lived and died in Athens and came from a wealthy and moderately politically connected family, but also the importance of Plato as an individual in the Western intellectual tradition. It's important to note that Plato was born, lived and died in that same intellectual tradition which I examined in the pre-Socratics episode. But it's also important to note that there is both a break with that earlier tradition and an entirely new conception of both the metaphysical and physical world, as understood by Plato and by his teacher Socrates. So how important is Plato anyway? Alfred North Whitehead was once quoted as saying, "The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato." What does he mean by this? It doesn't mean that Plato said everything there was to say. It's just that he started the conversation. He touched so many subjects in all of his voluminous writings, and he brought so much insight with his initial critiques and with his initial discussions that he really set the scene for the rest of the philosophical discussion that went through early antiquity through to the modern era in the Western context. And it's for this reason that we really should commend a lot of time towards studying this incredibly important character. Plato lived in a very intellectually diverse tradition in the Greco world. He was influenced by numerous different facets, and each of these had a very different impact upon his own individual thought. I'd like to start off by looking at the different aspects of influence that existed outside of Socrates, who I'll talk about later, who was probably the most profound and important of these influencing factors. Some of the Platonic influences included the poets, and by the poets I mean people like Hesiod and Homer. Now, they influenced Plato both in terms of the cultural context in which he lived, but also in terms of some of his most fierce adversaries. Plato saw the poets as those that were shaping and influencing Greco morality, and as such he saw them as some of the most important influences he needed to overcome. The Pythagoreans influenced Plato from another direction. They gave him this concept of the world as being intelligible through maths and geometry, and as the importance of these roles of intelligibility in the mind in understanding the underworking realities of the universe. Plato also drew upon the Eleatic school as an influence in terms of understanding the importance of permanent factors over the ephemeralities of the physical world. He didn't necessarily agree with their conception of the underlying unity, and I'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about his metaphysics, but he definitely drew heavily upon thinkers such as Parmenides. The influence of the Milesian school upon Plato is a much softer and subtle in its nature compared to that of the Eleatic school. He didn't necessarily subscribe to the same substantival view of the universe as proposed by many of the Milesian school. However, we do see echoes of the Milesian school in some of the later metaphysics written by Plato, including in the work The Timaeus. Finally, one of the most important, profound, and significant influences comes from the schools of the Sophists. Thinkers such as Gorgias and Protagoras provide not only a key adversary to Plato, and in many of his dialogues we see the contestant being Plato's Socrates on the one hand, and on the other hand the Sophists, who are attempting to undermine this dualistic view of the universe that he proposes. But also they provide the mechanism by which Plato attempts to understand and to propagate his ideas, which is the dialogue. We now turn to Socrates, who I've already stated several times is the most important influence upon Plato. Now, Socrates is possibly one of the most important philosophers in the Western intellectual tradition, mainly due to the fact that he was so influential upon Plato. However, we have no written works left behind by Socrates. The only representations we see of Socrates is by people that either didn't like him very much, as we'll talk about a little bit later, those that were trying to exonerate him post his execution by the Athenian people, or by Plato, who leaves us the largest corpus of Platonic and Socratic dialogues. So it's really difficult to tell where the real Socrates begins and where Plato begins to just be the individual who's using Socrates as a puppet to propagate his views. And I'll attempt to utilise the next couple of slides to try and examine this question in more detail. As I already stated, there are other visions of Socrates besides those which are propagated by Plato. The two most important of these see very different individuals. The comic playwright Aristophanes, in his play The Clouds, portrays Socrates as somewhat a fool, as someone who attempts to understand aspects of reality that are really worthless and don't really provide any true understanding, but also as a somewhat corruptive figure, someone who is undermining the traditional norms of Athenian society and who presents a danger to that society. On the other hand, in Xenophon's Memorabilia, we see a sage-like figure for Socrates, somebody who is rather conservative, is propagating the status quo, but gives out very conventional wisdom in an attempt to better his fellow Athenians. And this is very different from the Platonic Socrates, someone who is radical, someone who is undermining the status quo by challenging it, and as such trying to force people to become better. And as such, I want to move more towards this true version of Socrates as portrayed by Plato to better understand him. Now, I've stated here the true Socrates, and in some ways, I think this is a bit of a misnomer. We will never know the true Socrates. We are too far removed from the individual, and most of the primary source material has been lost to the ages. However, I think that the pursuit of the true Socrates has become a philosophical and intellectual pursuit in and of itself. And I think it's important to examine it because of the way that Socrates has a lasting influence through it to this day. For those that are critical of Socrates, they see him as an ironic scoundrel. By this, I mean thinkers such as Nietzsche see Socrates as someone who uses their irony in a very condescending manner to their fellow citizens, but also towards themselves, in a sense that Socrates makes his humanity a slave to cold, unreasoning, inhumane rationality. And in this sense, Nietzsche sees him as someone both who denies his inner humanity, but who is in some ways denying the humanity of all people. For other thinkers, and for the majority of modern thinkers, Socrates is seen as a moral paragon, someone who was willing to put their life at the feet of true justice, of true humanity, of truth in general. And this is very peculiar because a lot of these thinkers who laud Socrates as this absolute perfection of the scholar, philosopher willing to die for the truth, are also generally those that are quite critical of Plato and try to contrast Socrates as a moral paragon with Plato as someone who is willing to subsume truth to what he would see as necessity. And I'll talk a little bit about this later in The Noble Lie, but it's important to see this sort of dichotomy between Socrates the paragon and Plato the authoritarian, which is sort of pursued by some thinkers when they try to examine the Platonic and Socratic legacies. So who is the true Socrates? I would argue that Socrates is more a mirror than a man. We are so far removed from the individual that we never will understand who Socrates truly was. But I do not think that the task of trying to understand Socrates is futile. by examining Socrates, we end up raising our own moral and ethical judgments into the light, and Socrates acts as that mirror by which we can examine these judgments and examine our own thought processes and sort of come to understand the flaws and the imperfections that exist within them, and as such can act as a corrective medical treatment for those of us who are seeking to understand our morality and our ethics in a more fuller perspective. Having discussed Socrates, I now want to move on to looking at Plato's metaphysics. Now, what do I mean by the term metaphysics? This is a bit of an anachronism in some ways, because metaphysics is actually a term that is eventually proposed by Plato's student Aristotle. But what it generally refers to is the study of the true underlying reality of the universe, and those things that exist outside of physics. In some ways it's deeply linked to ontology, or the study of being. The Platonic metaphysics is really an understanding of the world which is fundamentally different from that had been proposed by the pre-Socratics, early Greek philosophers, including the substantival views, the view of monism, and that view from Gorgias of nihilism. And it's the view of dualism which I'll now examine. So in the Platonic metaphysical view, there's realistically a dualistic understanding of the universe. And I'll explain that as we get towards the end, but in some ways it needs to be understood through the differing layers with which the world is created. So the bottom layer, as in the layer that is furthest from universal truth, is the layer of art. And he sees this not only including paintings, but also things such as sculpture, but also importantly things like poetry. And he saw them as mere shadows of true physical objects. Obviously, if art is the furthest from metaphysical truth, we then see physical objects as being more real or more true than art. So the physical objects that are sensible in our everyday lives. So an apple, a table, or a person. For Plato, these physical objects still were too impermanent, too ephemeral to universal, unchanging truths to be true reality. And so he saw existing above these physical objects a realm of ideas and mathematics, things that existed beyond the physical and which were incorruptible in a way that the physical objects could be corrupted. Finally, existing above the world of the mathematical, intelligible ideas, there was the world of the forms. Now, for Plato, the forms are these objects which provide the universal truths, which then propagate out through ideas, through maths, and then into physical bodies, and then down into art, providing that underlying, unchanging substance which gives true meaning to reality and to the world. So here we can see within Plato's metaphysics there exists a dualism. And what this means is that the universe is essentially created from two parts. For Plato, these two parts are the sensible, so those objects that we can perceive through our sensory apparatus, so physical objects and art, and then the intelligible, those objects which we understand through our mind and our rationality. And for him, these are things such as mathematics, ideas, and the forms. So I have now mentioned several times this idea of the Platonic forms. Now, this is a very unique aspect of Plato's philosophy, and it's very important to understand because it's a very complex aspect of his metaphysics, and the argument he's making is rather difficult to comprehend if you haven't actually read through a lot of the documents individually. Plato argues that in the physical, the sensible world, we do see many instances of justice, of courage and wisdom, but these aren't justice, courage and wisdom per se. That is to say, they are not the forms or the permanent incarnations, avatars, whatever you want to call them, of justice, courage and and wisdom. These are merely imperfect physical representations of true justice, of true courage, true wisdom, true beauty that we encounter in the physical world. For Plato, all of these true forms exist up in the intelligible world of the forms, but they're all in some ways emanations from this single point, the single point of unity in which all of these true forms emanate, and that for him is the good. And often in Platonic literature we do see the good being represented as the sun, because Plato likes to sort of describe the good as acting like the sun. We see things because of the sun, we perceive the forms because of the good. The most striking allegory which is used by Plato in the Republic is that of the cave, when he talks about the forms in the physical world. For Plato, most people are like prisoners. We are chained to a wall with our heads bound, only able to look at the wall. Behind us, we have a fire which casts light upon the wall of the cave. And in between the fire and ourselves, there is a parade of shapes which cast shadows upon the wall. And for most people, those shadows on the wall, that is reality. For the philosopher, however, when they are freed from their chains, instead of looking at the wall, they turn back and they are blinded by the light of the fire, and they see the shapes for what they are. They are merely a facade. They're not true reality. And as they climb past the fire, out of the cave, and into the real world, the sun bathes the real world in light, and they perceive reality as it truly is. They perceive the true realm of the forms. And for Plato, an important aspect of his ethics is that it is a true philosopher who then descends back down into that cave and tries to free his fellow men and women from the bonds of superstition and the inability to perceive reality because of their conditions. And it's a very important aspect of his politics, which I'll discuss later. Progressing further into Plato's metaphysics, but now also moving into his epistemology, or his understanding of knowledge, we now examine Plato's conception of the soul. Now, it's important to see the soul as this animating aspect rather than the Cartesian or Christian conception of the soul, which is very current in modern parlance. We need to see the soul rather as that animating factor which makes us human and alive, but also for Plato, that aspect which links us to the divine realm of the forms and which then proceeds after us following our death. Plato's conception of the soul saw it divided into three separate parts, a tripartite soul. The first and most basic aspect of our soul was seen as dwelling in the gut, and that was the desires, or the appetitive soul. And an example of this that was utilized was the envisagement of a hydra, the many-headed desires clawing away and driving us forward. The second aspect of the soul was the spirited soul, or the bestial aspect of our soul, often represented as a lion, and this was seen as dwelling in our chest. This was the passions that could drive us forward, could drive us to do courageous but also mean things, and for Plato it was this aspect of the soul that could be directed so as to help achieve virtue, but which was not necessarily going to achieve virtue by itself. The final part of the soul was the rational soul, and this was often represented as a man and was seen as dwelling in the head, and it was the rational soul which was seen as the king over the other two aspects of the human soul, and which would direct it through rationality towards virtue. Plato and the Phaedo actually depicts the human soul as a chariot. He sees it as one white horse, one black horse, and the charioteer. For him, the black horse is the desires that seek to drag us down back towards earth and all of the earthly pleasures that we desire. The white horse is the spirited horse, which can naturally be directed upwards, which drives us forward, and it is a necessary aspect of controlling our own body. But it is the charioteer and the charioteer's control which directs the soul either upwards or downwards. Another important aspect of Plato's metaphysics is this conception of reincarnation, which is borrowed from the Pythagoreans and potentially from Indic philosophy. And it's this idea that the soul goes through cycles, where a soul that is very good goes up into the world of the forms, into the perfect world eventually, while the soul that is bad is punished, and then potentially, if it becomes a tyrannical soul, is permanently left out of the cycle of rebirth and permanently tortured. And then this is an important aspect of Plato's epistemology as well, because Plato sees all knowledge and all thought not as an aspect of learning or education, but rather as an aspect of remembering. We are remembering the true forms that we experienced as part of our soul's existence in the world of the forms. We're remembering the knowledge that comes from this other world, rather than creating new knowledge in our own minds. We'll now examine how all of this metaphysical and epistemological theory in Plato eventually feeds into his ethical and political theory. For Plato, the political situation for most of Greece, in his mind, was that of a ship. In the Republic, he uses the analogy of the ship of state to depict how a polis exists. This ship is commanded by an extremely strong but dumb captain, one who cannot speak or hear or think correctly, but who is very strong and powerful and controls the wheel. Now, all the occupants of the ships, the sailors, they want to control the ship and turn it in certain directions. And whilst in control of the ship, they'll have full access to its larder and stores. Now, there's only one person on the ship that actually knows where they're going or how to get there, and that's the navigator, who's been staring up at the stars the entire time, which is sort of a reflection on Plato's conception of philosophers drawing upon such areas of thought as astronomy and mathematics, but they are weak, and they, to use the analogy of the cave earlier, if they've returned from the world of the forms, they've been blinded by the light, and now they've returned back down into the cave, and they're blind. They can't see because they've been out in the sunlight, and now back in the shadows, they can barely tell shapes apart anymore, and so the rest of the ship laughs at them. In Plato's conception, the rest of the ship crew are the politicians, the tyrants, the demagogues, who will whisper sweet nothings to the captain, get him drunk so that he grants them power over the ship, and then, whilst in charge, they will revel and party and live life to its sensual fullest. However, they risk wrecking the ship of state on the rocks as they are negligent at the helm. For Plato, the only way for a city, or for that matter a soul, to be virtuous, happy, and to live a blessed life is for it to be subordinated to rationality. For Plato, the majority of the populace are what he would call people of iron, brass, and clay. They are tradespeople who are focused on acquiring or producing goods, and as such work with their hands, and for him they are necessary, much as the appetitive aspects of the soul are necessary to sustain life, but they need to be controlled. To protect the citizens, the people of brass and clay, both from themselves but also from other predatory city-states or other people, we also then need those passions, the second aspect of the soul, the bestial soul, which drives us forward towards things like courage, and this is what he would call the people of silver, the guardian class who watch over the society and protect it from evil and harm, a permanently militarized class, something that is believed to have been drawn from the Spartans, noting that on several occasions Plato seems to show some sort of affinity or at least appreciation of the Spartan system of government. And it's because of this that we have this sort of feeling of authoritarianism and at least oligarchy that exists within the Platonic political and ethical construct. However, it is not enough to have these guardians protecting the population. There also needs to be a small cohort which is governed purely by rationality, which directs the rest of the populace towards the good. And it is sort of in the same construct of the Tripatite Soul, where you have rationality being lord and master over the passions and the desires. In the perfect society, in a Platonic sense, you have the people of silver, the people of brass, iron and clay, and over the top of them we have the philosopher king, or the people of gold. And it's this rational technocratic class sitting above them all which directs the ideal society towards the good. Now, some have asked how Plato would bring his perfect society into being, and in the Republic he does cover this at some length. It's important to note that he sees education as being the primary mechanism by which this society would come into being, and the society itself as being intensely communalistic. In fact, many communists of the 20th century saw their lineage going all the way back to Plato. However, it's the mechanism by which this society is brought about which modern thinkers find quite distasteful. Plato saw it necessary to utilize a noble lie to control the society, to turn it into the perfect society. For himself, he saw it as a necessary precondition that a mythology be taught to the occupants of this society, which made them believe that it was divinely ordained that each of these individual classes existed, and that each individual class as a person was allocated specific duties, specific privileges, and specific responsibilities, which prevented them from attempting to desire things outside of their realm of responsibility. And he saw this recognition of the responsibility of each individual caste, if you want to call them that, as a key precondition for the society to exist. As the society would be built upon this noble lie, Plato also saw it as fundamentally necessary that poetics and music, in this case we're talking about stories, education, philosophy, etc., would be tightly controlled, and censorship would be the mechanism by which to prevent individuals being exposed to bad thoughts and bad ideas. Plato took this very seriously. He saw censorship as necessary to protect the minds of the guardians and of the philosopher kings, so as to prevent them from becoming undermined and essentially corrupted by the external world and by these false thoughts and ideas. This is why, once again, we see so many modern thinkers criticizing Plato as an authoritarian, as someone who is a handmaiden to fascism or totalitarian communism. And it's interesting because there is an allegorical way by which we can read the Republic, which suggests maybe Plato isn't talking about politics. Maybe he's purely talking about the individual soul, and he doesn't actually believe that such a society could ever come into existence. What he's talking about is the need for us to fortify our minds and our souls against corrupting influences outside of ourselves, and the necessity to subordinate those bestial and appetitive desires to the rationality in our own minds. But I personally don't subscribe to this more allegorical reading. I do think that Plato was heavily influenced by the death of his teacher, Socrates, who was put to death in a democracy by democratic action, and so had no real love for democracy. But I will discuss this a little bit later in the Platonic Legacy. Now, there's two ways that people have attempted to synthesize Plato's work as a whole, to understand who Plato is, and also to depict how his thinking evolved as he grew older. One interpretation sees Plato as a failure. They see him as coming to terms with, over time, especially post the Republic, that his metaphysical conception of the forms is overly complex and doesn't really stand up to the criticisms that are eventually levelled against it by people such as the Peripatetics, so the followers of Aristotle. And in this sense, we see his later works, things such as the Laws or the Timaeus, as increasingly complex attempts to justify his philosophical, metaphysical worldview, which don't really succeed. And in this sense, some people see Plato as a bit of a tragic figure, someone who gets to the end of his life and really feels like he hasn't achieved or accomplished what he set out to do. For others, Plato has achieved a complete system. Plato really, through the Republic and the earlier works, provides what Kuhn would call a paradigm by which he can then begin to flesh out the rest of his philosophical system. And it's realistically these later works that are increasing in their complexity that are attempting to fine-tune the details that already existed back in the Republic and back in those earlier works. These are some of the people that also prefer that more allegorical reading of the Republic. And so they see works such as the Laws, which is a work which tries to provide, I suppose, a more pragmatic and practical mechanism for establishing a good society in the real world, as some of the real fruits of the Platonic system. Plato has had a hard to overstate impact upon the Western intellectual tradition. And I'm not necessarily going to talk about how that legacy has impacted down to our modern time, because I think that if you have a real interest in philosophy, you'll be able to see in the fact that Plato is still such a titanic figure who, whether or not people disagree or agree with him, provides sort of the boundary stone and the marker by which all other philosophers in the Western tradition measure themselves. And as such, I really want to focus more so on three aspects of the Platonic legacy which are troubling, and which make it difficult to see him as the truly important figure that he is. As I've previously stated, Plato has often been accused of being an authoritarian, and in some ways I definitely agree with this line of thinking. I think that when we examine the circumstances of Socrates' death, and the way that Plato describes his perfect society, that Plato is inherently suspicious of the mob. He sees democracy as demagoguery, the rule by the mob, and he sees it as a mechanism by which those unscrupulous aspects of society can gain control. And it's important to realize, though, I also think that Plato sees democracy as in some ways inherently important to the pursuit of virtue. In the Republic, he talks about the collapse, or the inevitable collapse of the perfect society through a democracy, so a society based on honour, through to an oligarchy, then to a democracy, and finally into tyranny. And when he talks about democracy, he says that the democratic man will involve himself in all aspects of life. He'll try a little bit of farming, a little bit of fishing, a little bit of maybe tragedy, and then maybe even a little bit of philosophy. And and when he talks about a society in which their perfect society could eventually arise, he says that perhaps it is only a democracy in which such a perfect society could eventuate. And as such, I think we don't need to necessarily overstate his hostility towards democracy. One of the more radical aspects of Plato, and one that is warmly welcomed by modern feminists, is that Plato, when compared to the rest of Greek society, held women in rather high regard. He saw them as people that could equally undertake the intellectual rigours of philosophy. in his perfect society, he saw them as participating in the same education. He didn't necessarily see them as being completely equal. He reserved that they would not actually participate into politics until their 30s, and he didn't see their participation in military activities as compulsory as it would be for the male citizens. But it's a radical break with a rather patriarchal view within the rest of Greco society, which saw women often veiled, married off at a very young age, and are unable to leave the house. And because of this, Plato has been seen by some as a bit of a feminist icon, although I would hesitate to call him such. I don't think that Plato really represents an emancipatory figure, and although he doesn't really discuss slavery, for instance, it is difficult to see him as taking an abolitionist standpoint. It could be hinted at in some of his work, but equally, for instance, in one of his dialogues, the Meno, you can see that although he describes the slave as being possessed of the same rationality that exists in all other men, he also isn't really someone who is standing against this whole conception of slavery, this edifice. He's rather, I think, someone that would embrace the Aristotelian concept of the natural slave. He would see these slaves as being less rational than their masters, and as such, Platonic Dialogues could definitely be utilized as justification for the subordination of the irrational slave to the rational master. Finally, I'd like to discuss Plato's metaphysics. Now, Plato's metaphysics are very complex, and when exposed to Occam's razor, are very difficult to support. In fact, many modern thinkers find it very difficult to utilize Plato's metaphysics in anything other than a demonstrative fashion. They're not really utilized as a modern set of metaphysical values which many people subscribe to. However, I think it is important to realize that Plato's metaphysical system in some ways provides a bit of a golden standard in terms of a system by which the rest of the Western intellectual tradition really needed to set its teeth to. And although I do not necessarily subscribe to the dualism which Plato offers in his works, the conception of this ephemeral externality and the eternal immortality of certain values, such as morality, such as truth, justice, and beauty, I think that really still serves an important aspect, and moral realists rely upon these kinds of conceptions to justify their own metaphysical and ethical systems. This finishes the episode on Plato, and I hope that you've enjoyed today's episode. Please either follow my blog or subscribe to this channel for further videos.